This is Jarvis DeBerry with NOLA.com, and the Time is Picayune, and I'm talking this morning with Professor Thomas Aiello of Valdosta State University in Georgia. And he has written a book called Jim Crow's Last Stand, Non-Unanimous Criminal Jury Verdicts in Louisiana, about the very peculiar system in Louisiana that allows felony convictions with a 10-2 vote. So thank you, Professor, for joining me this morning. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Talk to me about why you're interested in this topic and how it came to be on your radar.
Well, I am a researcher of Black history, and I am a native of Louisiana. I have written several books about the history of Louisiana. Nothing as about a topic as serious as this. And when I didn't find out that Louisiana had this system until after I left, and was shocked to find that out, and wanted to figure out why and how that was, and just did my best to try to figure that out.
You talk about early on a man called Samuel Lawrence James. Who was that man, and what is his legacy, and how does it tie in to this system that we have now?
Oh, Samuel Lawrence James, known as S.L. James, he was one of the most powerful people in New Orleans, and one of the most powerful people in the state. He was actually from Tennessee, but came to Louisiana in the 1850s, fought for the Confederacy in the war, and then continued to be in New Orleans. He was a civil engineer, but he ended up making lots and lots of money, and was able to use that money to kind of garner himself a lot of influence. And after slavery had run its course, after the war was over, Louisiana begins creating this system known as convict lease, this program whereby they could manage to kind of re-enslave the Black population by finding that one loophole in the 13th Amendment. Of course, the 13th Amendment freed the slaves, but it says that you are allowed to keep people in bondage as long as they commit crimes. That's the reason why we can keep prisoners in jail, even though that is a version, I guess, of slavery. And so they started this program like all the southern states did. Louisiana did it differently, though. Whereas most of the southern states just kind of used this system to collect convicts, lease them out to various plantations or businesses that needed free labor, Louisiana privatized its system. And because S.L. James was so rich and so powerful, he was able to get himself in 1870 a 21-year contract to control the convict leasing system for all of Louisiana, and to facilitate all of these criminals that he was going to lease out and make money off of. He leased a plantation on the Mississippi River known as Angola, which of course today is still the state penitentiary today. It became public after his reign ended. But he's important for creating Angola. He is important for creating the convict lease system in Louisiana, and for authoring a lot of the prison policies that we have in place today.
And you suggest that the 10-2 verdict, or then it was 9-3, I think, that you can convict a person on 9 votes out of 12, that was basically designed to get him as many convicts as he could possibly handle.
Absolutely. Or to get the state as many as they could handle. I mean, okay. You have to understand, I mean, Louisiana had almost a majority Black population. That when slavery ended, you just have tons and tons of people who just appear on the rolls. You need to figure out, and you lose all that labor. You need to figure out a way to get that labor back. If the South is ever going to compete again with the North, they believe the only way they can do it is with free labor. And the only way they're allowed to do that is by finding that one loophole in the 13th Amendment. Convict lease is going to become the norm across the South. And actually, it is going to be it's going to be worse than slavery in many ways. Slavery, for all of its problems, has this kind of long-term investment built into it. If you are a slave owner and you are willing to buy another human being, that's gross in its own right, but at the same time, you have an economic incentive to make sure that slave lives long enough to provide you with the labor that you've paid. Convict lease gives you the sentence of 6 months or a year, and you don't have to care about the health and well-being of that person after that time. And so the death rate in convict lease is super high. The racial disparity in convict lease is overwhelming. There are white people who serve in the convict lease system, but they are the rarity. They are the exception. It is almost uniquely black, and it was a way to re-enslave the population that the government had taken away from them after the Civil War. So,
I think all of us would raise our eyebrows now if, say, a black defendant in Louisiana was convicted of murder by an all-white jury. But
right.
if there were 2 black people on a jury and 10 white people on a jury and that person was convicted, does that black defendant have any case or any legal standing to quibble about the racial makeup of the jury?
Yeah, yes, I think he has even more of a case than he would otherwise, because what the 10-2 jury verdict does is it allows those white jury members to exclude the voices of the black jury members. And so I think that the racial connotations of what that could be in a case like that is exacerbated even more by the fact that it's a 10-2 jury, and it allows for the majority, the mainstream, the white male majority, to kind of dominate over juries and not worry about the minority voices that sit on those same juries.
People wouldn't think that there are a whole lot of similarities between Louisiana and Oregon, and yet we're the only 2 states that do this. And you suggest that Oregon had a similar reason for creating the non-unanimous jury verdicts for that state.
It's true. Oregon seems like a weird counterpart in this story. But it turns out that Oregon got their non-unanimous jury verdict law a little bit later than us. We got ours in 1880, right around the time that convict lease was really taking off and throughout the South. Oregon didn't get theirs until the mid-1930s, but it was still a law that was kind of functioning around issues of bigotry. Oregon, of course, in the 1930s, there are several kind of national factors that play a role. We're having our war on crime. It's when bank robbers like John Dillinger were popular, and people were worried about that. It is right after the period of the rise of the mafia. But locally in Oregon is dealing with a weird set of circumstances. They have all those Okie migrants that John Steinbeck talked about, who they did not like. There was a large Ku Klux Klan population in Oregon. The Klan was very popular. Only Indiana, I think, was a greater Klan state outside of the South than was Oregon, and it was actually brought there, fittingly enough,
by Louisiana, right?
From Louisiana,
yeah.
Who brought that there. But even though there isn't a large black population in Oregon, there is a large Jewish population. There's a large immigrant population, and they don't like that population. And Oregon ends up getting this law. Its kind of push for the law ends up centering around this one case where these 3 Jewish men end up murdering these 2 Protestant people, a man and a woman, in a retributive murder case over love gone wrong. But the murders happen execution style. And so it combined immigrants and Jews and the mafia and all that kind of stuff into one. And the murderer, the guy who actually pulled the trigger, is convicted of a manslaughter charge instead of a murder charge, because one of the jurors believed that he had justifiable cause. And so they ended up giving him 3 years instead of the death penalty, and that enraged white Oregon and helped push this law over the top. But it was designed for the same kind of thing. It was designed around an attempt to not let minorities push the majority around.
Wow. You say that Louisiana has not done a study to see how the non-unanimous verdicts actually play out. Statistics-wise, but that Oregon has, and that 65.5% of trials between 07 and 08 featured a jury vote that was non-unanimous on at least one count. And you call that a startling result.
Yeah, 65% of the, I mean, that's 65% of their population that wouldn't be in jail if they provided their standard that 48 other states and the federal government provide. The standard that we've all come to know as normal, the standard that we see on TV every time we watch Law and Order. Those people wouldn't be in jail.
A question has always puzzled me. Do sometimes people vote, the two people say, I'm not going to vote guilty because they know they have 10 votes already to convict? Are there any stories, or is it even possible to figure that question out?
Yeah, that is a really interesting one, and people have talked about that, but it's always been anecdotal. I don't know if there's any way to actually study that specifically. Yeah. But it's interesting that there have been a lot of jury studies. Most of them end up using Louisiana and Oregon as just kind of counterexamples, as the weirdos in the bunch, because if you're going to do a study of juries that you want everybody to read, you're going to want to include the unanimous jury verdict. But it's actually in those studies, they argue that women and minorities are the first people always kicked off of juries by prosecutors. They always, when they do get on juries, they tend to be shouted down by white males in the jury room. And it's interesting, we also have studies, cognitive studies, that demonstrate that minority groups, members of groups that have been stereotyped, and women cognize information differently, cognize evidence differently, and think about it differently, but that their voices often don't get heard as much because they tend to be shouted down. What the unanimous jury standard does is it ensures that those people get a voice. The supermajority standard that we have in Louisiana makes it easier for those voices, which we've already demonstrated kind of get lost in the shuffle, get even further lost and don't have a chance to have their say.
You talk about in your book how the Supreme Court has made some puzzling and even inconsistent arguments when it comes to whether a jury should be unanimous or not. And I know Louisiana very famously brought a case in the 70s to the Supreme Court about unanimous or non-unanimous verdicts. Is there any chance, any likelihood that another case could be brought, or is this pretty much a settled matter now?
I don't know. I would like it to, but I'm not sure. It is weird. There is this kind of weird double standard that the Supreme Court has ruled about the contradictory, your mention of the contradictory kind of rulings. You're right. There are many states, several states that allow 6-person juries. This became really famous a couple of years ago with when George Zimmerman killed Trayvon Martin. He was tried by a jury of only 6 people in Florida, and that became a thing. People started talking about that then. Louisiana has various crimes that can be tried by a 6-person jury, and they actually tried to make a supermajority standard there, where 5 out of 6 jurors could convict. But the Supreme Court struck that one down. They said that that wasn't enough. The argument, I suppose, is that since 12 people has been the common law standard, that is enough to create a supermajority. But if you only have 6 jurors, you need to have unanimity, which does seem to kind of contradict. I don't know if any case on appeal could ever make it back to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was very divided, but they did rule in Johnson v. Louisiana in 1972 that this was okay. And every time the Louisiana Supreme Court has seen one of these cases, they have said, well, I mean, this has been decided. I mean, this has been decided. We already have an answer to this question. I think the only way this gets fixed is through the legislature in Louisiana, trying to kind of realizing what happened with their counterpart legislature in 1880 and again in 1898, and saying, we want to undo that. I don't know if that'll ever happen, but I think that's the way that would get done.
You call your book Jim Crow's Last Stand, and you say that this law is a vestige of the Redeemer movement or the anti-Reconstruction movement in Louisiana. Two last questions. One, what has been the state's justification for why this law works? I mean, clearly they're not going to say, well, we want to more easily put people in jail, or we were fighting Reconstruction. And,
Right.
and secondly, why do you think that the civil rights establishment kind of overlooked this law when they were fighting so many other laws like it?
Right. Okay. Well, as to the first question, Louisiana's defense of the law tends to run on a couple of different tracks. First of all, is consistency. They argue that what we're trying to get in due process is a measure of consistency. That's what the standard is for due process. If that consistency isn't unanimity, that's okay. As long as everybody has the same standard, that should be fine. Second, they argue that this eliminates the tyranny of the minority. If you have 11 people on a jury who are completely convinced that a person, for example, is guilty, but you have this one person who isn't, in any electoral sense, in any other part of our democracy, the 11 would win. And so by having a system whereby one person can derail an entire trial, we're actually going against the dominant standard that we set for ourselves in every other aspect of our democracy. And the other argument they make is expediency. Having a supermajority standard eliminates hung juries. It eliminates retrials. It saves the state lots and lots of money, so they argue. That turns out not to be true. Our number of retrials is about the same as other places, but that's the argument. The argument is that it eliminates the hung jury. As for the civil rights movement, it's interesting that this law kind of hides in plain sight. When everybody was asking me kind of what I was working on, I was telling them about this. You know, all my friends in Louisiana, none of them knew that this was even a thing because they hadn't been tried in court. They didn't know. This law does really hide in plain sight. There are, even though I think they are wrong, there are legitimate arguments for having this law that don't center around race. And so if you didn't know that this was the product of the convict lease system and the product of Jim Crow, it wouldn't be as obvious as, say, for example, the signs on a colored water fountain. It's not as obvious.
Yeah.
It hides from the system in a way that other more obvious problems don't.
Well, I really appreciate you writing the book, and I read it very quickly, and I would recommend that other people read it too. And I thank you for taking time out to talk to us. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you.